Whether you are active social media user or not, it is very likely that over the last week you probably heard the news about Twitter, the social media, recently purchased by Elon Musk. Twitter is going through a crisis. Some employees were made redundant and others decided to leave Twitter. Many users are in search of an alternative. And I would like to tell you now that although I speak about Twitter now, and already mentioned it twice during this service, my speech today will be a bit more than 240 characters. For a long time now, our society has had many questions about social media and internet communications in general, and all the ethics around it. If I have a Twitter account, is it mine? Or does it belong to Elon Musk? What rights and responsibilities does a social media owner have over its users and their content? Can a Twitter owner unilaterally decide who has the right to speak out and who should be blocked? If it is a responsibility of a Twitter owner to ensure freedom of speech and protect people from abuse, how can both be fulfilled at the same time? You might ask what it has to do with us here. These are the questions that Elon Musk must answer now, which is partly true. But excuse me for a pun, with the Twitter crisis, a little bird brought all of us an important moral dilemma. It's relevant not just for the virtual world, social media. It affects almost all aspects of our lives today. What does it mean to own something? Does it give you an unlimited power over it? What are your responsibilities as an owner? This week's Torah portion, Hayei Sarah, literally translates as the life of Sarah. Whoever wrote this, whoever decided on the division of the Torah portions, had a very good literate taste and perhaps a little sense of humor. The portion Hayei Sarah, Sarah's life, begins with Sarah's death. Rashi, the French commentator, tells us that this is deliberate. And its main purpose is to underline the juxtaposition with Sarah's life, with the previous portion, with the binding of Isaac in the previous Torah portion. Rashi and many other commentators suggest that Sarah's death is a direct result of hearing of her beloved son's near death at the hands of her husband Abraham. The rest of this portion, and perhaps the rest of the book of Genesis, is the consequence of this event. Perhaps it was the result of Abraham's sense of guilt that he decided to pay a very, very high price of 400 shekels of silver to buy Machpelah, the burial place for Sarah, and the first piece of land he ever owned. In comparison, Prophet Jeremiah paid his cousin Hanamel 17 shekels of silver, 17 shekels of silver, for the entire field of Anatoth in the land of Benjamin, over 20 times less than the price Abraham had to pay for his piece of land. Abraham insisted on paying the full price, even though we just read he was offered it for free. This became the burial place for many of our patriarchs and matriarchs. Sarah was buried there first, then Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, and Jacob. Rabbinic legend also tells us that Adam and Eve were buried there too. Rabbi Avidan Friedman writes that the very act of Abraham's purchase highlights his refusal to act fully as the owner of the land that he has been promised by God. In other words, God's promise is not enough to own something. The residents of Het call him the Prince of God, recognizing his status. God told him it was his land and the land of his descendants. He is offered the land for free, but still he doesn't feel entitled to the land, and calls himself Ger v'toshav, stranger and resident, bowing to the people and insisting on paying the full price. Religious promise and ideology were not enough for Abraham to become the full owner of the place. He needed agreement and peace with his neighbors too. According to Midrash, Machpelah became one of 3 places in which the nations of the world cannot accuse Israel of theft. They were purchased and their ownership was not assumed. The others being Joseph's burial place and the Temple Mount, the site in Jerusalem where the Temple Mount is, purchased by King David. Perhaps for the Midrash, Torah text can serve as sufficient proof of ownership. We, however, cannot treat biblical text as proof of legal right. What we can do is learn a moral lesson from it. It's not enough to have a religious belief and scriptural reasoning to make a certain claim. You need to be a good neighbor and deal with the reality of today's world. It's not enough to assume that something is yours. You need to be like Abraham and support it with pragmatic evidence, agreement with other people, and resources. Torah's perspective on ownership, therefore, is to be ger v'toshav, stranger and resident. Even if you think you have the moral right to the land, one needs to deserve ownership. And even when one does, it doesn't give you the right to do whatever you like with your possession. In 1932, Martin Buber published Kingship of God, his work where he introduced his views on leadership, peoplehood, and relation between nations of the land. His work was an implicit critique on the racist ideology that has risen and spread in Germany at the time. Buber took the theological view that God is the only one real master of the land. Using the famous quote from a Shabbat song, from a hymn that we often use, God is the only Adon Olam, the master of the world. The priests and Levites in the Hebrew Bible didn't belong to the land-owning tribes. Following this idea, Buber argued that all people should try and declare themselves servants and guests, migrants and residents on God's land. In another essay, Buber writes, "The desire to own land is not condemned by the Hebrew Bible, and renunciation is not demanded, but the true master of the land is God, and people are nothing but sojourners, gerim v'toshavim, in God's midst." In other words, from the perspective of the Torah, all the earth belongs to God, an abstract and transcendent God that cannot be manipulated or controlled. Later in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, all people are called gerim v'toshavim, the same name that Abraham gave to himself. So why does the Torah insist to restrict the idea of ownership? Perhaps because true and moral ownership is not about entitlement and assumptions, but responsibility you take to look after your possession. It is to be in charge of a piece of land, therefore, is to be in charge of its maintenance, is to make sure that people in this land and around it are not oppressed and have fair treatment. This is what it means to own something, but still feel like you are a stranger and resident there. In contrast, when you own something as a master as opposed to a stranger, you feel entitled and too comfortable. When you own something as ger v'toshav, the stranger and resident. You look after it and take responsibility. You become a servant of the land and the people who live on it, and make peace with your neighbors. We can apply this principle to many, many modern examples. Israel is too obvious even to mention. People who are in charge of social council houses ignore the needs and cries of people, are like masters of the land who don't want to be on the same level with people who live in such houses. Sometimes it seems like the political decisions of many modern countries are made by masters and not residents serving their land and their people. As we begin the hardest winter in many years, we can probably remind ourselves that there are many people in need around us. Food banks and warm spaces have become luxurious for some people in this country and all over the world. And I cannot even imagine what it means in places with direct conflict. It doesn't mean that it doesn't matter who owns Twitter and who owns what. We are all gerim vetoshavim, strangers and residents in this world. We can look after each other, help each other, and make sure that there is peace and mutual support, at least in places where we are owners, where we are so-called owners. Ken yehi ratzon. May this be God's will.